colleagues and friends and comrades, good evening, everyone. Allow me just to say thanks for the life and the precious contribution of Prince, who passed today. And to say that I am honored to be asked to make this presentation in memory of Professor Elsa Goveia, who was a friend and a mentor. And it truly is an honor to speak in association with her memory. When I joined the history department at Mona in 1979, Elsa Goveia was, of course, the intellectual hero of that department. It was an extraordinary history department. It was the department of superstars. It was like the West Indies cricket team in the 80s. Almost everyone there was a distinguished professor. It was quite a remarkable place, and I was the rookie who walked in and sat down and said, one day I would like to be like these people. But I remember my first departmental meeting. I walked in early, and she was the only female member of the history department. And there was one soft chair, and I sat on it. In those days, we used to have metal chairs in our university. And the professor came in, and still remembering some good manners, I got up and gave the professor the soft chair and tried to sit in the metal chair. And she looked at me and she said, "Sit down, young man. I'm not in favor of discrimination for women." And I thought, oops, and that was an education. But I want to make reference to my very first seminar in the history department back then, and she was the chairman of that seminar. And I gave a presentation on the 3 attempts at rebellion in Barbados in the first 100 years of settlement. There were 3 attempts, and they were all, of course, aborted. They were betrayed and so on. And I spoke for about an hour and a half on these 3 things that did not happen. And in her summary, she said, well, if young Beckles is going to speak for an hour and a half about 3 things that did not occur, God help us if he was to speak, if he were to speak about something that actually happened. So tonight, I'm going to speak about something that actually happened. So this is for Elsa. This is for Elsa. It actually happened. And I remember I went to Mona on a temporary contract. I went out. I was living in the UK. England was my home, my family, my friends. And I went out to Mona because Woodville had arranged that, Woodville Marshall. And I went to Mona for just 1 year to go back to England to start an academic career in a British university. I said goodbye to everyone, but Elsa Goveia passed away, and I was in my family home in Birmingham, and I was called and told I have to come back to Jamaica and fill the vacancy left by Professor Goveia. So I went back to Mona to walk into these shoes of this extraordinary scholar and intellectual. So this is for Elsa. I'm going to speak about something that actually happened. But I want you to see the photograph. It's important. That's the photograph that was on my ID when I went to Mona in '79. And so I'm going to speak about many things that actually happened. The battle for Barbados in 1816, not just an uprising of enslaved people, but a battle for the island, and I will speak about that concept as I go along. I want to speak about the movement before and after 1816, and I want to describe in detail what the records suggest, that there was a bloodbath in Barbados in 1816. A tremendous massacre of black people in 4 days on the island. Reference is made in some documents to 1,000 black people killed in 3 to 4 days, but there's some other records that speak to a higher number. And I want to speak of the concept that Barbados, the rebellion of General Bussa, was the mother of all Caribbean rebellions. And I'm going to explain this very carefully, but I will give you a hint. There had not been a rebellion in Barbados, or an attempt to organize a rebellion in Barbados, for over 100 years. And in the entire 18th century, when rebellions were endemic across the Caribbean, when African rebellion was the norm across most of the Caribbean territory, there wasn't one rebellion in Barbados. And therefore, when it finally came, it assumed proportions that were shocking, destabilizing, and very disturbing. It is the one place you would not have expected it, but it happened, and it resonated across the world. And I will speak about the conversations that followed, not only in the Caribbean, but across the world. I also want to speak about 150 years of white writing, and I call it racist writing because it is racist writing. It is writing that begins on the assumption that the black community in Barbados was not capable of organizing such a revolution. The early historical writing described this revolution as a skirmish. There was a small skirmish in the parish of St. Philip. It is impossible for anyone who went to the archive to look at this revolution to describe it as a small skirmish. So why then was it called such? Then there was an argument to suggest that it had nothing to do with the black community in terms of its intellectual conception, that it was Wilberforce and the British abolitionists who had deluded the enslaved population and encouraged them, urged them into action. Then there was a view that it was a free colored man by the name of Washington Franklin who had been dispossessed by his brothers. His father had left property for him in his will. His white father, his white brothers contested the will, and this young man was dispossessed of his property. He became a disturbing force in the community, and they accused him of responsibility for this rebellion, went to his home, took him out of bed, and put a rope around his neck. There was a conversation about the delusion of the black community, and the literature speaks to an inability to locate intellectual and planning functions within the enslaved population. There is, of course, a psychosis associated with white power because it cannot concede that despite its capacity to control and to manage, that within the subordinate people, there's an intellect. It's the same conversation we have around cricket. It's the same conversation. For 100 years, you played calypso cricket. You had no brain. You just enjoy yourself. And then you learn to win. You practice all the skills of strategy, of leadership, of vision, and you win. You become a global leader, and you're still not given the respect because what? You are just not playing the gentleman's game. You are using physical brutality upon the game that requires sophistication. And then when you start to lose, you go back to being calypso again. So you cannot, white power cannot concede an intellectual capability in a subordinate group. So there's an ontology of white consciousness that in the slave society, the white community owns everything. They own the buildings, they own the land, they own the people, they own their children, they own the children's children, and having established that architecture of ownership, then they own the history, they own the interpretation of the history, they own the theoretical reflections on the history, they own everything in the world of existence. So the writing in that consciousness emerges in this way, and so we have a tradition of white Barbadian history, which we understand. It is not about individuals, because persons are an element of a culture that has groomed them. The methodology I want to use in this presentation is to situate the Bussa moment in time, to begin with 1626, when the Barbados settlement is conceptualized and the money is raised to implement a strategy to settle this island, take it over for Britain, right through to 1816 when the revolution occurs. Then I want to move on. It is the first of 3 revolutions that took place in Barbadian history. The second I'm going to look at is the 1876 revolution, and then I'm going to go to the 1937 revolution. So I'm going to situate these 3 revolutions in a certain context. And the context is 340 years of colonial rule, that the black people on this island were the property and the chattel, and later on the located chattel of a white power structure. So the methodology then is to go forward and backwards and to situate this history within that context. Then I'm going to ask the question, through whose eyes are we going to interpret this material? And I have chosen 2 pairs of eyes through which to view this. The eyes of Bussa, who is in the middle, and this revolution has occurred in the middle of Barbadian colonial history. So from 1626-27 down to 1966, and in the middle of this long span come the Bussa Rebellion. So I'm going to look at it through his eyes, those who came before him, those who came after him. And I'm also going to look through the eyes of the Lords of Harewoods. The Earls of Harewood are the longest slave-owning, property-owning family in the history of this island. They came to Barbados in the 1640s, started small, a few plantations, a few properties, and like me, they originated in St. Andrew. Their first plantation was in St. Andrew. Then they amassed the largest fortune in the history of Barbados, and their own plantations on this island. They survived emancipation, they survived independence, and they own sugar plantations in Barbados as late as 1975. So from 1649 to 1975, the Lascelles family that became the Lords controlled property resources, people on this island. So it's a tremendous pair of eyes to look through from the vantage point of the context and the structure of how this island was made and how this island structured itself. So those two conversations I'm going to look at. There's some interesting documents I'm going to share with you from time to time. This is one of the most interesting personal descriptions of the Bussa Revolution. You'll find this in the New York Public Library, stashed away in the archive in the back. It was quite a shock to get hold of it many, many years ago. And there are lots of reports like this that for some reason didn't find their way into all of the early historians, the white historians who described this revolution, because these reports by individuals who were there are very detailed in their description. I'm going to make reference to a lot of these documents and bring them to your attention. Let's go at the beginning, therefore, with the argument that Barbados is the first black slave society in the world. Elsa Goveia's definition of a slave society is a society on whose economy is built entirely on slave labor. The society is structured entirely on the basis of slavery. The governance model and the ideology of the society, all of that are predicated on the assumption that it cannot be sustained without slavery. That's a definition that is now the working definition of historians, so that a slave society is quite different from a society with slaves. So many of the societies in the Caribbean and the Americas had slaves, but the presence of slaves does not make it a slave society. If you take Brazil, for example, Brazil had maybe 20% of its population enslaved, but another 60% were native indigenous people, then a few Europeans. So the indigenous native population was the majority, the Africans were a minority, and so on. When the Spanish came to the Caribbean, and Cuba and Puerto Rico, yes, they had the indigenous peoples, they had a large white population, they brought some Africans, again, the Africans are the minority. So this system that was created in Barbados was absolutely unique. It was the first time that the entire economy was built and sustained through enslaved labor. The legal structure, the ideological system, the political governance, the whole model was contained around chattel slavery. And furthermore, Barbados becomes the first society in the Americas where Africans are the majority. From the late 1650s, around 1660, 1661, Africans are the majority in Barbados. And it's the only place in the entire Americas where this is true. So Barbados is unique. And it's the model, it's the template on which all the other colonies were based. We can trace the movement of African labor being used for slavery right across the Atlantic. First, the small islands off the coast of Africa, Sao Tome, Cape Verde, Canary Islands, and the Portuguese brought a few Africans to work on these islands. Then it came to Brazil. Then it came through the Caribbean, and all of that. But again, along that trail of bringing Africans to work on plantations, in forests, in mines, Africans were in a minority. Barbados is the first place where Africans assume majority status. It was not a coincidence, it was a highly structured design to build this economy. And from the beginning, the provisions were being made. So the first provision, 1636. The governor makes a proclamation on this island, 10 years after settlement. All Africans imported into this island are deemed to be slaves forever, unless a contract exists prior. They open a little capacity to allow some people, because some of the merchants were quite comfortable to employ individual free Africans to work for them as valets, as chefs, as personal attendants, and so on. But the model is very clear. The assumption is that on this island, every African person is deemed to be a slave forever. Then the governor makes another proclamation. Because we have invested most of our capital in African labor, because you come on the island, you buy a plantation, you buy 150 acres, you have to buy 120 Africans, you have to buy horses, you have to put up buildings. Your African labor is your largest single investment. Therefore, you have to protect it. The laws then says, our Negroes are our properties forever. This is very important to establish legal foundations for the investment and the legal infrastructure on which the economy is going to be built. You cannot build an economy with insecurity about property rights. The first thing you have to do in any market economy is secure in law the capacity to own and to pass on through hire, through will, whatever, property. And the Africans are property. They go on to design a system in which the female African is seen and quote as perfect property. And this is a remarkable concept, because the reason why the female African is perfect property is because she can reproduce herself. And if you buy a car, you know, as it comes out the garage, it begins to lose value. You buy a female, let's say the standard price of a female in Barbados, the standard price of an African female in Barbados at this time, in the 1640s, 1650s, is about £30. So you go to Bridgetown Harbour, you buy her for £30, and if you're fortunate, she will give you 3 or 4 children. The child is worth more than the mother when the child is weaned. So by the time the child is 6 or 7 years old, the child has the same resale value as the mother. So you get 3 or 4 children, and the mother has reproduced her investment 3 and 4 times. So she's perfect property. And you then legislate the system that the status of slavery passes through the female line. The legal structure is very clear. The status of slavery does not pass through the male line. It passes only through the female line. So this is to protect white men from having their colored children making a claim on their property. So if a white man has a child with an enslaved woman, the child is born, but the child has no claim. Now, the critical part of this, therefore, is that a white woman cannot give birth to a slave child. And the laws were very specific, and I will show you later on the dozens of colored children who were born of white mothers, but they were born free. Had to be born free because the white woman cannot be the conveyor of slavery. The black woman is the conduit through which slavery passes on from generation to generation. So if a black African man has a child with a white woman, the child is born free. All of this is set up in the legal structure, and the first constitution, so to speak, of Barbados is the 1661 slave laws. This is the constitution that frames the structure of the slave system, and it is the first of its kind in the world. The Spanish and the Portuguese, who had been employing enslaved Africans before, went through a series of complicated structures to respect the humanity of the enslaved Africans. The Spanish and Portuguese Catholics would say, well, you have to give them time to worship. You have to convert them to the Catholic faith. You have to give them provisions for clothing and food. And all of those kinds of exceptions were put in place by the Catholics under the pressure from the church to give these enslaved Africans some space to carve out for themselves a humanity. The English in Barbados says we are breaking with that tradition absolutely. Africans are not human beings. They are property, they are chattel, they are real estate, and the law is explicit. And because they are not humans, they are not subject to any civil interaction or any civil law to which white people have to associate. So therefore, as property, that had to be instilled in the Constitution. So the legal structure is perfectly clear. And, you know, it's the laws, and whereas the people of Africa are a barbarous species and blah, 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 may it be deemed that they be governed separate and apart from, and all the provisions are there. This is an act that sets up a system of terror for every offense, and the offense range from looking into the eyes of a white person to raising an arm to strike a white person. The range of punishments are absolutely designed to break the spirit of rebellion. And one of the projects I'm working on at the moment, I'm working on a project that is mapping systems of punishments in slavery. So far, I have cataloged about 440 different ways to punish Africans. The full range, the full range. But the punishment of these Africans generated a phenomenal managerial creativity in the white community. You have to imagine systems. I tried this afternoon to get hold of Carl Watson because Dr. Watson, when we were colleagues on the Mona campus 30 years ago, he gave an interesting seminar in which he catalogued the castration of black men in Barbados. And it was an interesting piece of research in the 18th century because castration of black men became a common system of punishment for a series of offenses. And I was hoping that he would publish that paper because it's a very important piece of work. Because if you castrated a male, he bleeds out, then you have to get your money back. So you write to the treasurer, and the treasurer under the Act, the 1661 Act, compensated you for the loss of your property. So in the records of the treasury are payments to slaveholders for the castration of their slaves. So we have this list year after year after year, compensation to slave owners for the castration of their male slaves. Now, this is not simply a construct of slave owners in Barbados. It's a construct of the British government. It's a construct of the monarchy. It's a construct of the merchant and financial classes of Britain. It required the consent of the royal family, and eventually we know that the first large slave-owning corporation was owned by the royal family. King James II was the chairman of the board of directors and the largest single investor. So this system was conceptualized as the most modern economic system the world had ever seen. And it's important to understand this because you've arrived in the Caribbean from Europe, from England, let's say, Britain. You buy 300, 400 acres of land. You bring 300 Africans from Africa to work for you. You bring your market operations, your financing from Europe. You bring in some foods and other materials from North America, Virginia, and so on. You imported grain. You produce a commodity called sugar. You exported it back to the global world, and you make a fortune. So you are an international entrepreneur, bringing factors of production from all over the world to bear on your business. These people who established this structure were the first generation of international entrepreneurs in the world. And they created a phenomenal global structure to allow them to make the fortunes that they did. Now, the first description we have anywhere in the records of what the Africans thought of Barbados is 1694. In the diary of a slave trader, He wrote in his diary in 1694 that the Africans have an apprehension of Barbados worse than we have of hell. Because the ships are moving between Barbados and Africa. Ships are coming, bringing Africans and moving. Sailors are moving. They know the ships are coming to Barbados. Barbados is the largest slave market in the Americas. It's the largest slave market in the Americas, and the word goes around. So the Africans in Africa know what is happening in this place called Barbados, and they have an apprehension of it as a place worse than hell. John Birkenhead, who visited this island, he visited Barbados in 1654, and this is what he wrote in one of his letters, that in Barbados, the Africans are treated worse than they do dogs. Because he's understanding that this is a unique structure that has no parallel and has no precedent. The economics of it are also quite clear. The English, for the first 20 years, had tried to see if they could use white labor to start up the plantations. So they tried to use the white labor, the prisoners, the convicts, and all of that. And like most places, you adjust the judicial system. So because the English ruling class were invested in Barbados, they told the judges and the magistrates, adjust the criminal justice system. So if people were found guilty of offenses, the judge will say, transportation to Barbados. So the judges were now sentencing people to Barbados because Barbados needed a labor force. And as you know, there's always a relationship between judicial systems and economic systems. So the first generation of slave owners came to the conclusion that we can deploy 3 blacks cheaper and more productive than 1 white. And the moment that economic equation was established, then white labor had no future. And it was finished. It was finished as an economic system. The African system became the basis. Barbados became a plantation economy where 90% of the land space was allocated to plantations. In other words, there was no other place like it on earth. A space where almost 100% of the space is allocated to one project, plantations. No frontier, no options, no interior, no mountains, no forests. One plantation after the other. The House of Commons in England concluded the conversation to shut down white labor in Barbados. There were rumors circulating in Barbados that some of the poor whites were being treated like the Africans because they were poor, they were landless, mostly illiterate, and they are in the employ of investors who are seeking to maximize the return on their capital. And therefore, like all workers who are vulnerable, they are exploited. Two of them were able to get a document sent to England in 1659. Mr. Rivers and Mr. Foyle, who were political prisoners in Salisbury, who had joined in the anti-Cromwell resistance, found themselves as convict laborers in Barbados. Sent out one-way ticket, never to return to the realm. They got a letter back to England that they have been treated like the Africans on this island. The House of Commons discussed and debated that petition. It is the first occasion in British parliamentary documents that a clear vision of the Africans and of European labor was spelled out. If you read that parliamentary debate of 1659, debate over the petition of Mr. Foyle and Mr. Rivers, members of the House of Commons are in tears to hear that white people are being treated like Africans in Barbados. And it's a highly emotional debate because some of the members would get up and say, Mr. Speaker, I am moved to tears by what I have heard. And it's a very painful conversation in the House of Commons of England. But in the end, the Speaker made the fundamental statement. The Speaker said, the history of Britain is the history of the gradual freeing of the lower orders. And if we are enslaving our own people in Barbados, we are men most miserable. And ordered that the system be shut down. And ordered that that system of white bondage be removed. So we can see then the British parliamentary intervention in the labor affairs of Barbadian sugar planters. It went to the very highest level, and Britain made it very clear, the House of Commons made it very clear, that that system had to be shut down. They suggested instead the complete use of African labor. And thus we had the first of the major slave trading companies. And you can see here the crest. This is the crest of the Royal African Company, 1672. King James II becomes the chairman of the board, as I said. The stock is owned mostly by the royal family, and it has a charter to deliver 4,000 Africans to Barbados per year at the price of £16 per female and £18 per male. That was the manifesto of this company. And it went off to work and did a magnificent job in supplying labor to this society. The Barbados slave owners, therefore, became, in the first generation, the richest men in America. There were no men in any colony in America, in Brazil, in North America, Central America. There were no men in any colony in this hemisphere who had established fortunes as large as those of Barbados. These were the success of the imperial empire. Since Columbus, strategies have been put in place to turn these colonies into money machines, and most of them were not successful. Barbados became the first successful experiment in how to make a fortune out of agriculture in the Americas. It also became a graveyard for Africans because 60% of them died in the first 5 years on this island. But Barbados developed a reputation also as the most brutal, the most violent society in the history of the modern world. People were talking about this island in the 17th century. Not only was it the richest society in the Americas, it was also the most brutal society that modernity had ever seen. Because the only way you're going to make a fortune is to brutalize 60,000 Africans who are trapped on these plantations. And you have to control them, you have to brutalize them, you have to dominate them, you have to replace them, burn them out, replace them year after year. It's a machine that generates a profit. It has to chew up these people in order to sustain itself. Brutality became the norm. Barbados became also the most militarized society in the Americas. There was no other society with as much military capacity. All whites were organized, white males were organized into parish militias. There were residential garrison troops on the island. British professional soldiers were here. White men were brought in from England. Poor whites were brought into England and used as militia tenants. Plantations were required to keep X number of white men per plantation. Based on the number of slaves you had to keep a number of white men on the estate who were the militia. So you have a structure where on individual plantations there was a small army. The parish had an army, and then there was the British army at the garrison, coming and going. It became a military complex, and these Africans are trapped in this military complex. There were attempts at rebellion, and this is what I was speaking about with Elsa Goveia 30 odd years ago. Despite this, there were attempts at rebellion in 1649, 1675, 1692, all crushed, all defeated, betrayed on the inside. There's some interesting points because the 1692, which was organized by Kofi, betrayed in the final stages of planning. The strategy was that since the majority of the Africans on the island were from the Gold Coast, mostly Ashantis, Kofi was going to be crowned after the white men were defeated. Kofi was going to be crowned as the King of Barbados. It's the first concept we have in the historical record of black people having a concept of government. And the concept of government in 1692, that they were going to establish a black monarchy under King Kofi. And he was going to be installed in the ceremony of the stool, which we all know, the Ghanaian ceremony of the stool, and which is why when I had some influence on this campus, the administration building was designed in the shape of the stool. That is Kofi's stool that he wanted in 1692. So, giving Kofi his stool was an important part of the writing of history. It will now be written into the history of Barbados that there is a building on this island designed in the shape of the stool of the Ashanti, and it is Kofi's stool. Then the Barbados model, the successful Barbados model, now has to be exported. And it's going to be exported by the same men who built it. The first, the Jamaica model. The slave owners in Barbados, the island is too small. They want room to expand. They have to grow. Most of the slave owners have sons. The sons want to have their own plantations, so you have to grow and expand. Like all economic models, you reach a level of profitability, you expand, or you wither and die. So land. They tried to take St. Vincent and St. Lucia. The Caribs chased them out. Didn't succeed. The next model was Jamaica. They persuaded Oliver Cromwell to give them permission to take Jamaica. General Penn and Venables, they came to Barbados, and in Speightstown, they planned the invasion of Jamaica. They raised an army here in Barbados. Modiford, who was a governor here, financed the invasion. He wrote the bill that set out the financial plan, and Modiford made a deal that he would take Jamaica, he would finance the whole operation, and off the troops went from Barbados and took Jamaica. Modiford, who had done so well on this island, Drax, who had made a fortune at Drax Hall, and by the way, when they went to Jamaica, they took all of the good land of Jamaica for themselves. So the whole of the Ligony Plains were taken by Drax. Drax took the north coast, which is now you have Drax Hall on the north coast of Jamaica, which is based on the same model of Drax Hall here in St. George. Modiford took most of the Ligony Plains. And so there was Operation Jamaica. The idea was to take Jamaica away from the pirates who were wasting time. Beautiful land, waiting for sugar and slavery, and these pirates are fooling around. And of course, what they did, they made the deal with Henry Morgan. Modiford brokered a meeting with Henry Morgan in Port Royal and made a deal. Henry Morgan was wanted, dead or alive, because he was a former indentured servant on Barbados. Broke his contract, ran to sea, Welshman, wanted, dead or alive. Goes to the pirates. Modiford makes a deal with Morgan. And here's the deal. You help us to drive your friends out of Jamaica. You turn traitor against your friends. We will drive them out. We will turn Jamaica into a sugar plantation. And for that, I will secure for you a pardon. And so, they drove out the pirates. Morgan was pardoned. Then Modiford made another deal. Help us to settle this matter, raid the Spanish Main, and bring the money back to Jamaica to finance sugar plantations and slavery, and I will give you a knighthood. Modiford arranged for Henry Morgan to get a knighthood. So he became Sir Henry Morgan. In 1 minute, he's a pirate, wanted dead or alive. Next minute, he's Sir Henry Morgan. Henry Morgan then marries the governor's daughter and moved into the aristocracy, and then became governor of Jamaica. All financed by Thomas Modiford. Jamaica haven't done well and now converted into slaves and sugar. And the Barbadian plantocracy have made a fortune for themselves and they own most of it. If you go to the St. Andrew's Parish Church Cemetery and the Spanish Town Cemetery and go through the old tombstones, all of these Barbadian slave owners who had made their fortunes there are buried in Jamaican cemeteries. The next project is South Carolina. We want to move on. They persuaded Charles II to give them permission to take South Carolina from the Indians. They got it, they took South Carolina, and they went up to South Carolina. Sir John Colleton from St. John here in Barbados, he was the chief vestryman and the largest slave owner in St. John's Parish. He and Sir John Yeamans financed the South Carolina project. They went to London, met with Lord Ashley, organized their funding, and off they went to South Carolina, took control, took the slaves from Barbados and took them to South Carolina, took the slave laws in South Carolina, like Jamaica, became a diaspora of Barbados. And this is how the model expanded from one place to another place. It is not surprising, therefore, that South Carolina today, to this very day, is the most racist state in America. It is not surprising, the home of the Klan and all of that, because it started here in Barbados, the slave system taken to South Carolina, rooted there and run by the Barbadians, the Barbadian slave owners. But the kings of Barbados, the kings of this island, are these people. The Earls of Harewood, 1, 2, 3, 4, all of the Earls, and here I am having a chat with the current Earl. This is the current Earl, the 8th Earl of Harewood. From the 1640s right through. And the reason why Henry Lascelles became the first Earl of Harewood, forget to spell a mistake there, is that he had become the richest man in England without a title. He's the richest man in England without a title. Henry Lascelles. The king, of course, is the rational man. He's collecting his taxes from these people. So he says, I have to give you something, so he becomes the Lord of Harewood. What do you wish to call your earlship? He said, well, I'm from a village called Harewood, so I'm Harewood. I want to be Earl of Harewood. So he becomes the first Lord of Harewood. And it's a hereditary peerage. It's passed on down the family all the way down to David. Now, when David came to visit me here at K Phil 2 years ago, the shocking part of the conversation was, and at the time he came, I think David was like 48, 49 years old. It was the first time he had ever visited Barbados. The first time. And his family, and he has inherited all of this, and his family had built the biggest fortune. And it was his first time here. Quite extraordinary. You need to comprehend, think about that. But I will show you the little crib that they built in England out of Barbadian slave labor. Not a bad crib. not a bad place. Not a bad crib. Not a bad crib. To build out of the profits of Barbados and Jamaican slavery. But the interesting fellow here is the first one, because after he built this beautiful crib, 900 acres, and he's one of the largest castles in England, and in the basement of this castle are the papers of these plantations. The records of the Barbados slave plantations are in the basement here of this castle. And the reason why the 8th Earl came to see me was he wanted to hand over the documents from this basement to the university on the CD-ROM, because I had written a very unpleasant letter. But now we have them. That's the point. But he came to an interesting end. His valet found him in the bathtub with both wrists slashed, his stomach gashed from one end to the next, and his throat cut from one end to the next. Cause of death, suicide. Now, it's interesting to read the coroner's reports and all the medical documents, because the Lord had attended a meeting in the House of Lords 2 days before. He got in his horse and buggy, drove back to Leeds, came home, his valet gave him a meal and so on, and he went to bed, and in the morning the valet goes to ask the Lord what he wants for breakfast and find him lying in the bathtub in this state. The coroners were very clear. They worked out the sequence. The first sequence was left wrist first, stomach second, right wrist third, and finally, while this wrist still has some energy, the throat. And that was the narrative. But there were some other stories circulating around the castle that he had brought some slaves from the Caribbean, Jamaica and Barbados, to do the wood panels and the furnishings of the castle. The library had to be fancied up and so on with mahogany panels and all of the usual beautiful woodwork that you would expect in a place like this. And members of his family thought that it wasn't, that yes, it was suicide, but the African slaves had put a voodoo curse on him. And that conversation took place around the death of the Earl. But before he died, he had written a very important book. He had written a book called Instructions to Plantation Owners for the Treatment of Negroes. And it was a very important book. And he got together with 4 other distinguished Barbadian slave owners who were all living in England, maybe not in those castles, but in similar. And they wrote this important book published in 1786, Instructions to Estate Managers. And basically what they're saying is, the price of African slaves on the Bridgetown market had gone through the roof, because from the 1640s, when you're speaking on average 20 pounds per African, now at the end of the 18th century, the price is now 120, 30 pounds per African. So over 100 years, tremendous inflation in slave prices. And meanwhile, sugar prices are coming down, slave prices are going up, your input cost is going up, and your profits are going down. So you have to do something. That book told the Barbadian slave owners what they need to do to shift from buying Africans to breeding Africans. And it set out a whole series of packages, prenatal care, postnatal care. For each woman who becomes pregnant, you give her 5 shillings for the first child, you give her 10 shillings for the second child, you give her 15 shillings for the third, and you give her a number of financial incentives to the 8th child, and on the 8th child, you might offer her freedom. And this package is laid out, and of course, after 3 months of pregnancy, you take her out to the cane field and give her light work, and all of that because you have now to shift from buying slaves to breeding slaves. And the Lascelles, Edwin had mastered the art of this. Now, it generated a transition in Barbados. It generated the transition. Barbados did make the transition to breeding as opposed to buying. And all the other colonies were dependent upon buying Africans. Slave owners had to go to the market to buy new Africans every year. Barbados cut the African market and was reproducing the slaves domestically as a result of these strategies. Now, the final point here on this level is that here now is the vision of the first distinguished Barbadian historian, John Poyer, a white Barbadian intellectual historian, and he writes his view of the society that he is a part of. He is not a member of the landed classes. He's a clerical man, but he's well-educated, well-trained, and he becomes the island's first professional historian, I would say, because he wrote an important book, The History of Barbados, published in 1807, 1808. And he's describing his society. And he says, all societies have structures. Barbados is a society with two structures. There's the white, there's the brown, and there's the black. And these colors are reflective of intellectual capacity. They are reflective of the mental and intellectual and corporate capacities of the various colors. But that's okay so far. Then he says, nature has determined this structure. This is a natural structure, came into being by nature, and all we have done here, all we have done as legislators, is to legalize what nature has done. And this is the society into which BUSSA emerges. So, before I get to BUSSA, I will go to Lord Harewood. These are the plantations they own. Because I'm looking at this through BUSSA and the Earls of Harewood. These are their plantations. And as you can see, by this time, by 1816, when the rebellion occurs, only 19 of the Lord's slaves are born in Africa. You see? Because the plantations have shifted from buying Africans to breeding Africans locally. So he has a very small minority of his Africans, of his enslaved people, are born in Africa. The vast majority of his slave workers are locally bred. And these are his main plantations. But in addition to those he owns, they have a management interest in 8 other plantations, because he would purchase, invest in, or manage on behalf of someone else other plantations. So you can see the empire is partly owned, partly invested, and also partly managed. This is the world of Lord Harewood in 1816. These are the plantations in which he either owns or have a significant financial interest, or in which he is responsible for the management of on behalf of other investors. So he's pretty much spread all over Barbados. But they are in a celebratory mood. It's the end of the century. They haven't had a rebellion on the island in 100 years, or even a thought, a plan of one. So there's celebration that we have mastered the art of controlling Africans. We have broken the spirits of Africans in Barbados. There is no radical or revolutionary consciousness in the African population on the island, and Barbados is the most successful slave society in the world. It is the most successful because it is the most stable. If you haven't had a rebellion in a slave society in 100 years, its stability is therefore its most important feature. But the stability was based upon the presence of a phenomenal military complex. It was a highly militarized island, and it had effectively suppressed the African people here. This is what one of the generals of Barbados had to say, and this gives you a sense of how they felt about Barbados. He said, "The night of the insurrection, I would and did sleep with my chamber door open. If I had 10,000 pounds in my house, I still would have gone to bed with my doors open. So convinced I was of the attachment of my slaves. So comfortable we are that our slaves are attached to us. So comfortable. So comfortable that he would sleep all night with his doors open, like everyone else, because the Africans have been crushed." He said, I knew I knew something was brewing, he thought. He admitted he knew something was brewing, but didn't think for a moment it would have burst out the way it did. So that's the state of mind that we have to deal with. And this is the world. These are the plantations of Barbados. This is the world of the slave owners. These are all the sugar estates in 1816. We can see them here on this important map. This is the world in which this rebellion is being planned. We have some interesting documents from these military commanders on the rebellion. We don't have to rely on the official report of the House of Assembly that other people have done. The House of Assembly was just carrying out a political cover-up for the massacres they committed. Let us use the documents of the military commanders and the people who actually carried out the suppression of this rebellion. Let us use those documents. We have them. Let us use the documents of the letters of Colonel John Rycroft Best. He was a man who defeated BUSSA'S army at Lowther's plantation in Christchurch. His records are in the New York Public Library, his letters, and we have them here. He describes the defeat of BUSSA'S army in Christchurch. Those who said it was a little skirmish in St. Philip. He's describing what happened in Lowther's plantation yard in the clash where he had to mobilize the militia and the imperial troops to confront these Africans in Christchurch. And he describes here what happened. He describes what he saw across Christchurch. Canes burnt, houses burnt, great houses destroyed, the very floors of the houses destroyed, great houses absolutely brought down to the ground. The destruction, he says, is dreadful. He says it's hard to imagine that this level of destruction could take place in such a short time. And then he describes meeting these insurgents and surrounding them. And they are armed, and they are saying to his militia, come, you come, come. They're calling him and his militia to come and get these licks. The battle right there in Lowther's yard. But Colonel Rycroft Best is smart. Shortly before this rebellion, they mobilized the colored men. Colored men were not allowed to carry arms. Mulatto men, though they were free, and many of them slave owners, and privileged, the white slave owners still denied them full civil liberty. This gentleman decided to round up the colored men in his parish into a special colored man army, militia, armed them and told them, go and fight the blacks. And he sent the colored army in to fight the Africans. He described how we pursued them, how we fought against them. We killed some, others fled. These are quotations from his letters. He says, our success at Lowther's and our subsequent rapid movement for that day stopped the progress of the rebellion in Christchurch. The news of our success passed quickly to the rebels in the upper part of St. Philip and struck dismay. The free colored people behaved admirably. They would dash into a house full of rebels without looking for support and dig out the fellows. It was this intrepid courage that appalled the blacks. That this militia of colored men were sent in the first round of fire to confront the Africans at Lowther's. The fact is that many of the white men were afraid. Many of them had run to the fort and were looking for a ship to get off the island. So this colored army saved the day at Lowther's plantation. This was the first big battle of the rebellion. Best continues. His argument is that this rebellion was the result of Wilberforce's speeches in England, that these people are in the House of Commons speaking about Slavery must end, we must bring emancipation, and these Africans in Barbados have been, in a sense, brought into delusion in relation to this prospect. But then he changed his mind. After 3 to 4 days and a month of reflection, he changed his mind. He said, no, I got this wrong. He said, I once thought before, I am now convinced that they were not entirely at all led away by the business of delusion. They conceived themselves to be sufficiently numerous to become masters of this island. They believed they had the strength to take over this island. This was his final position. And this is what led them into war, that they could take Barbados and take control of it. His view was supported by an officer of the British Army who also wrote, Major Thomas Moodley, the masses of slaves tried by war to gain their independence. This is the language, this is the rhetoric and the language of the British military officials. Having defeated them in Christchurch, his letters then speak to the convergence of rebels at Bailey's plantation. And he described in his letters watching the rebels coming from the north, from the east, all converging at Bailey's, and he followed them and tracked them down to Bailey's plantation. Why Bailey's plantation? That's where Bussa is in charge. Bussa is the driver at Bailey's plantation. This is where he lives. This is where he is in charge. And the Africans are converging at Bailey's plantation. He says it's the rendezvous of the insurgents. Well, I would like to imagine that they could have gone to any plantation. And there's obviously a reason why of the 300 plus plantations in Barbados, they go to Bailey's. This is where they converge. He describes the first battle at Bailey's plantation where the convergence has taken place. He says, Tuesday morning we arrived at Bailey's estate. Bailey's plantation was owned by the Reverend Alexander Scott. And here the insurgents, about 400 in number, they attacked my regiment. We had deployed 200 men of the 4th Battalion and 200 of the 15th Regiment. The British Army had moved out of the garrison. They had joined Colonel Rycroft Best in Fairy Valley, and having defeated them at Lowthers, they marched through Fairy Valley, tracked them all through St. Philip, and then surrounded Bailey's plantation. He describes in his correspondence the surrounding of Bailey's, where Bussa and the rebels had converged. He also describes the strategy which was used also at Lowthers. One of the regiments that was taken out of the garrison was the Bourbon Regiment, the West Indian Regiment, which was a black regiment. The British had come up with this masterful idea that we might need some black soldiers to fight against the French in Martinique and Guadeloupe. It so happened that they were stationed at the garrison here, and so they brought them out, this black regiment, brought them out and unleashed them on the Bussa army at Bailey's. So in Christchurch, the mulatto army does the damage, and St. Philip, the black army does the damage. And he describes what happened there at Bailey's plantation. He also wrote in his correspondence, the insurgents did not think that our men would fight against black men. In other words, the African slaves are watching this black army coming. And somehow they don't believe that this black army is going to mow them down with cannons. So there's a moment of indecision. The black army is coming. Maybe they're coming to support us. Maybe they will turn on our side. The black army came in and destroyed the standing group at Bailey's plantation. 40 were killed in the first line of fire. 70 taken prisoners. 200 of them fled to Golden Grove next door. And when they got to Golden Grove, they barricaded themselves in the great house at Golden Grove. This is where they went for shelter from the cannon fire. But we opened cannon fire on the house. Cannon fire was unleashed on the great house where they were hiding. And over 100 were killed. And as it says here, over 100 were killed, leaping from windows and rushing through doors. Because the cannon fire has been unleashed on the great house, because this is where they consolidated. And he says, we killed 100 in the first round at Golden Grove. What we're speaking about here is a massacre. There were other battles across the island. General Haynes reported killing dozens in St. John. The Bridgetown rebels were dispersed. A regiment was sent to the city, because if you bring the army out of the garrison and the army is scattered across Barbados, then you leave the city exposed. Not taking no chances, they sent a regiment to protect the city while they were chasing Africans across Barbados. And St. Lucie on the Bourbon plantation, again, attacks in St. Lucie, and dozens were killed in St. Lucie. St. Andrew, St. Peter, St. Thomas groups were also attacked and dispersed. The whole island, so to speak. There were some other interesting moments. The Africans from the north are trying to rendezvous in the south in St. Philip. They were trying to get across the center of the island to connect back to St. Philip. Interesting moment. When they got to Mount Wilton plantation, coming through the center of St. Thomas, the Mount Wilton slave says, you all can't pass through here. Professor Marshall has written about Mount Wilton. Reynold Elcock, when this was all over, he wrote in his will that he was going to give freedom and land to the slaves who were loyal to him in the last rebellion. So they got the land for their loyalty to him in the rebellion. That is the origins of Rock Hall Village. Rock Hall Freedom Village, the first freedom village we call it. But it originates in a group of slaves who turned against their own Africans and were rewarded for their loyalty. That is how Rock Hall Village started. They got the land for their loyalty. What you would call in today's term, blood money. At the Bell Plantation, which was also owned by Lord Harewood, he too rewarded his slaves who were loyal to him. One of them, who had given the manager information about the rebellion, he received his freedom and £10 for the rest of his life. £10 annually for the rest of his life. Now, £10 in 1816 is probably about £5,000 today. So he got a pretty tidy sum at the Bell Plantation for his loyalty and his betrayal. The evidence suggests that Lord Harewood's plantations were targeted. They targeted his plantations. We have a list in his own records of all the damage that was done to his plantations. The Mountain St. George, £5,000. Even Curtin's plantation, which he had sold a few years earlier, had £10,000 damage. All of his properties were burnt, damaged. The sugar factories were destroyed. But Lord Harewood did what the others did. He compensated his managers. He gave them a bonus of £112. He freed a few slaves. And he organized a dinner function in London to raise money for Colonel Codd. Colonel Codd was the man who led the army against the Bussa rebels in Christchurch and St. Philip. He was the one who led the army at Bailey's plantation. For his good work at Bailey's, Lord Harewood organized a dinner for him in London and he made a donation of £200 towards the fund. So you can see the magnitude of this. In London, the Barbados slave owners are having a party to raise money for the man who saved their properties and who saved Barbados for them. The reprisals were horrendous. And in the reprisals, you could see the mind of the Barbadian slave owners at work. The strategy was to crush the black mind and body, imprint upon black children that they were slaves forever. The British troops in the garrison who had captives wanted to have the usual court-martials. You have a court-martial, you try them, you execute them. The slave owners, the white community in Barbados, preferred random executions. So there were random executions right across this island. Again, the bloodbath. The bloodbath followed the rebellion and went on for 6 months after the rebellion. Then the strategy of terror becomes important. The use of terrorist tactics. You will then hang the rebels in places where there was no rebellion. So they mapped the places where there was no rebellion and took the rebels to those places and executed them there as an example to the others. So you see here, Johnny Cooper, who was BUSSA'S lieutenant at Bailey's, he was taken from St. Philip and taken to Trent in St. Peter, and therefore he was strung up in Trent. Reverend Frere Pilgrim, he reported that Johnny confessed that he would fight for his freedom today or tomorrow. They were taken from Sturgis in St. Thomas and taken down to Redmond's village where they were hanged. Jack Groom was taken from St. John and taken to St. Joseph. So in all the places where there was no conflict and where the Africans seemed to be passive, they took the rebels to those places, put up the public gallows, and put a rope around their necks as an example to blacks in that part of the island. So this is how the strategy was conducted. Again, these are contemporary forms of terrorism. 3 mulatto men, Franklin, Roach, Sargent, and they were hanged, but not for rebellion, but for inciting revolt and for the disrespect of white men. The rebellion, the hangings continued right into September, and at the end of September, in the middle of September, the governor decided enough hanging, enough hanging. There were 123 of them left in the Bridgetown prison. They were put on a boat and deported to Sierra Leone. A month later, another rebellion again. Christchurch. This time it's seen as a smaller affair, and Colonel Best writes that, again, the leaders are the drivers, the rangers, the carpenters, the watchmen, the principal slaves. They are trying it again. The governor writes to England to say the rebellion was led by 2 men, disappointed at their first failure, endeavoring ineffectually to reproduce subordination. So they were crushed, but they hadn't given up. They're still trying to overthrow this plantocracy. There are the list of all the people who are classified in the official record of the Barbados Assembly. These are the ones who they identified. And this is Colonel Best's final conclusion after the Bussa Rebellion. This is an absolutely critical statement from Colonel Best. The disposition of the slaves in general is very bad. They are sullen and seem to cherish feelings of deep resentment. We hold the West Indies by a very precarious tenure, that of military strength only. I would not give a year's purchase for any of the islands we have right now. That sets out very clearly how the slave owners in the region are now feeling. It's coming to the end. It's coming to an end. Only military power can now hold slavery together. Only military power can hold it together. And this is where they've concluded. Because they conceive themselves to be sufficiently numerous to become masters of Barbados. So they knew that slavery is over. It is over. It's crumbled. The rebellion, the revolution, has revealed the fact that this island that had been stable in the showpiece of slavery has now crumbled into warfare. The next decade, the British government identifies Barbados as the site of a certain form of criminal mine. The parliamentary discussions in Britain in the 1820s are focusing on Barbados. They're saying that in Barbados there is a violent mine because they have been made aware of the blood spilling that took place after the rebellion for no apparent reason. And here is Wilberforce speaking about the bloody-mindedness of the Barbadian slave owners. Buxton is repeating it in the British Parliament, that there's a violent, evil disposition in this white community on this island, and that Barbados is now a disgrace to Great Britain. They are now washing their hands of it. The spilling of blood, Buxton said, spilling of black blood, he said, has now become a pastime in Barbados. And this is Buxton, the leading anti-slavery thinker and leader in the British Parliament. Wilberforce continues his conversation. But Colonel Codd wants to wash his hands of this whole affair. Colonel Codd is saying, I am a professional soldier. I go to war, we have captives, we take our captives, we try them. If they're guilty, we execute them. But you don't go around massacring people without trials. And he is saying, I wanted no part of it. It's the slave owners who are doing this. I am the leader of professional soldiers. We are stationed at the garrison. We don't massacre people this way. And in the end, he says, this is a quote from him. Under the irritation of the moment and exasperated by the atrocities of the insurgents and so on, the militia was induced to use their arms rather too indiscriminately. Black people who were just in the wrong place at the wrong time were just being mowed down. Colonel Best then says, my best estimate is that 1,000 Africans were killed, but he admits that's a conservative estimate. He says maybe it's twice that figure. Wilberforce gets in and he contributes. The blood spilt in the cane fields was the result of the intemperance of the slave owners in Barbados, who are treating their own home, he says, like a conquered foreign colony. This is how they're treating their own island. Right? Barbados slavery is the most unmitigated. They refuse to reform it. Wilberforce ends by saying, 1,000 human lives, it seems. Some accounts say 2,000 have been lost. So Wilberforce is saying his intelligence coming to him in the House of Commons is that it might be 2,000 Africans who were killed in those 4 days in Barbados. And they were killed, as you say, in the summary executions of the militia. But the Barbadians now have to deal with this. And they're saying, slavery is ours and we are defending it. This is a perfectly well-constituted society. Yes, the Africans have rebelled. Yes, we have crushed them. We have restored stability. This system has a future, and we are going to press on. This is our system, and we are going to defend it. And of course, what they do is to criticize Jamaica, because Jamaica is now saying, some of their leading absentee planters in England are saying, yes, maybe we should abolish this thing. Maybe we should abolish it. And of course, when the Jamaican slave owners begin to contemplate the possibility, the Barbadian slave owners see them as traitors. We will defend this. In fact, Mr. Mears, who was the Barbados agent in London, said, in one of his letters, he said, we built this model. We built slavery. We built this system. And since we were the ones who built it, we are the ones who will defend it. And those who took the system from us, Jamaica, those who took the system from us, we cannot expect them to defend it the way we will. We owned it, we built it, it's our system, and we will defend it to the very end. Buxton made a statement, he said in the House of Commons, that he is ashamed as an Englishman to hear Barbadians referring to that island as Little England. He is ashamed, he said, to be an Englishman and to be associated with Barbadian white people who are calling Barbados Little England. He says there is nothing English about Barbados. And he insists that they must cease and stop using that reference to Barbados. It's an insult to his status as an Englishman. The response of the Barbadians, they burnt Buxton in effigy in Bridgetown. They burnt Buxton in effigy in Bridgetown for that speech. But the conversation goes on. The Speaker of the Assembly in Barbados is defending the system is ours. He says, neither threat nor persuasion will ever induce us to put the finishing hands to a system that has come naturally into existence. We are not going to free the slaves. We are not going to have any conversation about emancipation on this island. We rather die, he said. We rather die than to end the system we created. That's the mentality. Then in comes Sarah Ann Gill after Bussa, gives a speech in Bridgetown in which she says slavery and Christianity are incompatible. You cannot be a slave owner and be a Christian. And she says that in a society when some of the largest slave owners are clergymen. Bussa's owner was a clergyman. The Reverend Alexander Scott was a clergyman. At the height of slavery in Barbados, one of the largest slave owners in Barbados was Reverend John Brathwaite of the St. John's Parish Church. The church are in the elite of slave owners in this country. And she says to these people, you cannot be a Christian and be a slave owner. And of course, they burnt her church. So they've now burnt Buxton in effigy. They have now burnt Sarah Ann's church. And then something interesting happened. Mary Higginbottom, a white woman in St. Philip, accused Robert, a slave, of raping her. This is a fascinating case because everyone in the parish is aware that Robert was having sex with Mary all along. Right? Everyone in the island knows that Mary was Robert's woman. But according to the records, while he was having sex with her, her white children came into the bedroom and she didn't want her children to see that, so she screamed raped and Robert was brought up. This was high drama in Bridgetown. High drama. He was tried for rape. That case was used as a test case. This is what emancipation means. Barbadian slave owners said, this is what emancipation is about. Black men raping white women. This is what they want freedom for. This is what Wilberforce wants. This is the meaning of black emancipation, for black men to rape white women. And the case became so popular that when the trial was going on, literally traffic stopped in Bridgetown. Everyone was following this. The white community came out in large numbers. Letters to the press. The Association of Concerned White Women organized themselves and wrote letters to the press that this case means that we are now a species most vulnerable. We cannot. And so the governor said, this is foolishness. They spirited Robert out of prison, put him on a boat, and shipped him off to St. Vincent and hid him. When the white men in Barbados woke up the next morning and heard that Robert was spirited out of prison and sent into hiding, they then said, well, okay, well, we're going to hang the governor instead. Right? And so they hanged the governor in effigy. They surrounded Governor House and they were saying, you come out of there, we're going to put the rope around your neck, somebody's going to hang, Robert is gone, you're going to hang. And so Barbadian society is agonizing in this last decade. It's going through the horror of what to do. So now you've burnt a church, you've burnt a British politician, you're now going to hang the governor, the president, and of course, the image of church burning. You see, understand, Barbados is one of the first societies in the Americas that burnt churches. Huh? So when you think of Virginia and Alabama and all the church burning, it started here in Barbados. The first Christian church that was burnt by slave owners, by a white community, was Barbados church burning. It started here. This is where the church burning started. So, you can see, therefore, the construction of mind surrounding the defense of this system called slavery that the white society of Barbados cannot let go of. There we go. We own slavery, it is ours. Lord Harewood comes to its defense. He sits in the House of Lords in England, and this is how he defends it. He says, we cannot free the Africans. Africans are an inferior species, not fit for freedom. They must remain under our tutelage. If we abolish slavery in the Caribbean, the region would collapse into darkness. And finally, the most powerful statement of all, we do not love slavery, he told the House of Lords. This is Barbados' largest slave owner. We don't love slavery, but we must have it. This is what he says in the House of Lords. We simply cannot imagine not having it. And so the act of emancipation is passed, and Lord Harewood is the man who wins the day. He wins the day. Despite all the strategies about freeing black people, he is the one who won the day and insisted that the slave owners should receive maximum compensation for the loss of their property. He was the one who held out, insisted upon it, gave speeches all over England, demanding full compensation to the slaves. And of course, then the Barbadians were well provided for in their slave compensation. But here's an interesting comparison. Slavery is now abolished. Slavery is abolished, it's the end of the road. Lord Harewood has slaves in Jamaica, and he has slaves in Barbados. He's trying to get the free black people to work for him in Jamaica, and they won't work for him. He asks his estate attorney to give them higher wages. The estate manager says, they don't want to work for you. The Lord said, double their wages. The manager writes back to the Lord, he says, the blacks told him, is free, we free. We are not working for you. We finished. We don't want wages, we want land. We do not want wages, we want land. And in the end, the final advice, and I love this statement, the final advice from the attorney, he tells the Lord, don't bargain with these black people anymore. Don't bargain with them. Don't have any more nammy-pammy conversation. That's an old Jamaican expression that has survived. No, don't have no nammy-pammy conversation. Don't have it. No more mammy-pammy conversations with these black people. So, sell off the plantations, shut it down, and move out to Jamaica. And that's what he did. Lord Harewood sold all of his plantations in Jamaica, collected his money, brought the money to Barbados, and expanded his plantation operations. And he says, back to his base, back to Barbados. He says, the blacks in Barbados are still bickering. Yes, my slaves are bickering, but I increased their wages and now they're comfortable. The estates, his estates were now producing more sugar. In the 10 years after emancipation, Lord Harewood's plantations were producing more sugar than in the decade before emancipation. So here is a tale of two islands. On one island, the blacks went back to work, became even more productive. On another island, they refused to work. They want land. Lord Harewood shut down and said, I'm back to my base. They started in Barbados, expanded to Jamaica, and now they're back at the base from which they came and stayed until 1975. The ex-slaves were interviewed. Reverend John Edgehill interviewed them, the generation after freedom, and said, well, what do you think about your past and your history? And this is the term that they use. The ex-slaves would call the slavery period the barbarity time. This is the term that they use. This is the language of African people in Barbados, being interviewed by a reverend 20 years after emancipation, and they are saying to him, the slavery period was the barbarity time. But the revolution comes again. 1876, exactly 60 years after Bussa, revolution comes to Barbados again. Exactly 60 years later. The Bussa Revolution was Easter 1816. The second revolution was Easter 1876. The exact 60th anniversary. The governor says riots have broken out all over Barbados. Riots have broken out all over Barbados. The second revolution has come. And in the second revolution is where you see the celebration of General Bussa. It's a second revolution. It's a celebration of General Bussa. This is what the Times newspaper wrote in its editorial. The Times newspaper is the colored people, the black people's newspaper. In other words, it's our newspaper. It is not the white people's newspaper. It's the colored and black people's newspaper. And in their newspaper, in the editorial, they spoke about the war of General Bussa. Why would black journalists and newspaper editors refer to somebody called General Bussa in the editorial in their newspaper? The war of General Bussa. Let me show you what the full editorial said. This is the full editorial of the Times, reflecting upon the second revolution. Since the publication of our last issue, the whole island has been suddenly thrown into a state of excitement and confusion, absolutely unprecedented in the annals of Barbados, and is attested by the oldest livers among us. The war of General Bussa was a comparatively partial affair, and the anticipated slave retaliations at the period of emancipation ended in smoke. That is, they were defeated. But this time, the riotous movement has extended its contagion from St. Peter in the north to Christchurch in the south. This is a newspaper editor reflecting on an island-wide revolution in Barbados, and he's making a comparison between the two revolutions. And he's the one who refers to 1816 revolution as the war of General Bussa. And there's a reason they call him General Bussa. Because at this time in history, the blacks in Barbados are using military and naval titles to identify their political leaders. This is the exact moment of the landship's origins in Barbados. Exact moment. When in the landship movement, they are mirroring the naval titles. And the landship movement begins precisely at this moment, where they're taking the titles from the Navy and applying it to their culture. And therefore, they transported that language into their black leadership, and Bussa becomes General Bussa. And this is what the parliamentary papers go on to say. So let's say you're now moving from the newspapers, you're now into the parliamentary papers. The parliamentary papers are mostly the correspondence of the governors to the British Parliament. The British Parliament are debating and discussing, and in those parliamentary papers, they're saying, the black people are saying that when the governor declared martial law, the black people will call in the martial law Bussa's martial law. That's what they were calling it, Bussa's martial law, in the parliamentary papers, 1876. Bussa's martial law. And the testimony is given by Mr. Grant. Mr. Grant's testimony is very interesting. Mr. Grant is the bookkeeper at St. Nicholas Plantation in St. Peter, and he's saying that in the revolution, that one of the rebels grabbed him, put a rock up against his head, and threatened to smash his head, and went on to say, we are not doing like Bussa. This is not like Bussa, because in their judgment back in 1876, Bussa had declared that we were going to attack the white people's property, burn their plantations, destroy their house, destroy the economic base of the white community, but we're not going to kill white people. But we're going to destroy the economy. What they're saying here now in 1876, we are not doing like Bussa. We will smash your head. Things have changed. And this is here in the parliamentary papers. This man is saying that the guy, we're not doing like Bussa. Bussa might have had a strategy, but this time we are beating up and killing white people. So that is there in the parliamentary papers. They also said that in Bussa's time, the Africans did not know how to use muskets. But now we do. He says, now we know. We know how to put the shot at the bottom and the powder at the top. Now we know how to use muskets. Things have changed. Now, of course, we have this statement from a St. Philip magistrate, the man who the police commissioner, St. Philip. He then wrote an interesting pamphlet in 1914. He publishes this, and again, this is a white legal officer. He says, he wrote a book in 1914 called the Barbados Handbook, and he says on page 18, in 1816, an insurrection of Negro slaves under the leadership of an African named Bussa. Why would a St. Philip white man write that? The black newspapers have said it, the parliamentary papers have said it, and here we now have a white member of the judicial community in St. Philip writing as early as 1914 to say that in the parish where he's from, this African man named Bussa organized this rebellion. This is not a black testimony, this is a white testimony. So, when Dr. Watson says that there's no evidence to show that Bussa is the leader, it is the psychosis of white supremacy which is unable to concede the possibility. That's what it is. And there is no amount of historical evidence that would enable him to concede that point. It is impossible to concede, because that is how white supremacy operates. It cannot concede. It will always find a way to denigrate. It cannot concede. But the evidence is here. The black newspapers, the white parliamentary papers, the white judicial system, they're saying, the people know who their leader is. We understand, we validate. And here is the leader of the 1876 rebellion. The same concept, General Greene. This is what is written there in the parliamentary papers, that the leader of this rebellion is a man named General Greene. So now you have General Bussa, now you have General Greene. And beneath General Greene is Colonel Bard, his name is Smith Bard, and then his lieutenants, who are the Doughton brothers. The parliamentary paper says that General Greene was shot in the right lung during a battle at Applewhite's plantation. Fascinating that the black people in this second revolution are again given military rank to their leaders. This is a list of all of the people who were killed and shot. And you can see there, J.P. Green, 27 years old. Young people. Young people. J.P. Green, 27 years old, from St. George, shot in the right lung at Applewhite Estate. Men and women killed, shot, fighting a war 60 years after emancipation, fighting a war, because slavery was still going on in Barbados 6 years after Bussa Rebellion. The people are still fighting for their freedom. They're still fighting for it and dying. From Bussa to Greene and to borrow. 250 years of crushing black rebellion has shaped the social structure of Barbados. White supremacy thinking and action is still the dominant power on this island. Blacks have a deep residual psychic fear of white reprisals because the white reprisals are always very bloody. Whites operate as a unified bloc and are aware of black resentment and feeling of unequal citizenship. The Clement Payne Rebellion of 1937, the third revolution, was crushed, but this time, again, similarly, a new alliance. And remember what I said. In Christchurch, the blacks were crushed by the mulattoes. In St. Philip, they were crushed by a black army. And now Clement Payne was betrayed by what is called the Negrocrats, the emerging black middle class that turned its back on Clement Payne. The independence moment, Barbados was divided. The white community on the whole did not support independence. They were against independence, strongly so. Barrow was fearful that the black people were fearful. And he knew that if he had placed independence before the people of Barbados in a referendum, they would have voted to stay as a colony. He did not trust them to vote for independence. And so he said, no referendum. This is a moment of leadership. The people are still fearful. And when the people are fearful because of this history, they require leadership. No referendum. The Barbados model persisted. People have spoken about Barbados as a global symbol of stability. The question is, what part of that is consensus and what part of that is repression? There is in Barbados a division of labor which says that the black community will occupy and control the politics and the white elite will control the economy. And this is an alliance for democracy. The argument is that the revolutionary struggle has come to an end. This is the end of history. It's the end of the road. This is now the new reality. The future. The Barbados society in its current structure is not sustainable. This social structure of white supremacy and black marginalization in the economy is not sustainable. The economic white supremacy system is subversive of democracy. It is not sustainable. All of us as citizens of Barbados have to examine this model and transform it. It has to be transformed in order to fulfill the vision of our ancestors. In BUSSA'S time, General Bussa, General Green, and Clement Payne. It can only be done if the economic democracy movement is revitalized and insisted upon, because in my judgment, the young people of this island deserves a more democratic society. They have paid their price in history for democracy and freedom. Reparatory justice is a critical part of that. And so, I thank you for the generosity of your perseverance.